I'm Gail Cuthbert-Brandt. I'm the interim Associate Vice President, Learning Resources and Innovation for this year, while Tom Carey is away on sabbatical leave. And I would just like to welcome you all here this afternoon, and thank you so much for coming out. We have a wonderful speaker this afternoon. I'm so pleased, George, that you came yesterday so we didn't have to worry about flights and those things, because the weather has taken a turn for the worse, as you know, if you've been walking across campus or driving here. So you're to be commended for coming in despite the weather. I'm sure that it's kept some people away this afternoon. This is our second annual President's Colloquium on Teaching and Learning, and I would remind you that the President's is a collective presidents with the apostrophe after the S, and I think that's really important because it shows the extent to which the Faculty Association and the University Administration have come together over the last number of years to say teaching and learning are really a very important part of being a research-intensive, world-class university, and we have been putting more and more attention, more and more resources into that area. This PCTL, as we use the acronym, is in a sense under the auspices as well of our Teaching Excellence Council. And so we've had a group working on this for a while, and I will thank them later on in the afternoon. But it's my great honor now to introduce our president, the president of the University of Waterloo, David Johnson, to come and introduce Dr. Koo.
Gail, thank you very much. I'm a minority amongst you in one respect, and that is that this weather is second nature to me. When you're born in Northern Ontario, as you know, you have skates put on your feet before booties. So whenever it's freezing rain, that's just an opportunity to go out and exercise a little bit. For those of you who don't belong to that minority, thank you very much for making the effort to cross the ice and be here today. Gail, I'm so glad that you pointed out that this is the President's S apostrophe colloquium, because it permits me to emphasize, as you did, how fortunate we are to have the interest and support and great enthusiasm of Royden Fraser and his previous colleagues who have been president of our faculty association and the association itself. It speaks volumes about the nature of this university when our faculty association is as deeply interested in very high quality teaching and a marvelous learning experience, and with us are constantly saying, how do we take a very strong community and make it an even better community? That permits me also to pay tribute, as Gail has, to the other organizers of this colloquium today who have brought Professor George Koo here. George is the Chancellor's Professor and Director of the Center for Post-Secondary Research at Indiana University in Bloomington. The center, his center, is home to the National Survey of Student Engagement, whose acronym is pronounced NSSE. The significance for NSSE to the University of Waterloo is quite substantial and has been for some time. We have participated in the NSSE survey only in recent years, but we have watched it for earlier years. And in 2003-2004, with our other G10 colleagues, the most intensive research universities across Canada, we engaged in the NSSE participation, and to our great delight, that initiative has been taken up by all of the 18 Ontario universities with the very strong encouragement of Minister Bentley, the Minister of Training Colleges and Universities, and will be, I think, a very important tool as the new Council on Higher Education, recommended by the Ray Report, comes into being, as it attempts to gather the best evidence it can from everywhere in the world on how we constantly improve our learning and living environment. I should tell you that our performance on the NSSE survey is not something that we should bring out the 76 trombones and start the march about. It's roughly average on the student-faculty interaction measure as compared with other Ontario and G10 institutions, and in fact it falls well below the equivalent U.S. doctoral institutions. Bob Ray cited this as evidence in his report, and to our delight cited this as evidence that Ontario universities are significantly under-resourced as compared to our U.S. colleagues, something that we all know, and by a very considerable measure, and drew a cause and effect relationship between those two, which is very important. But I think what we also know is, quite apart from financial resources, and that's a very large part of the equation, it's incumbent upon us in a spirit of self-renewal to constantly attempt to improve on our students' experience. Our university performs well on some other features, on the supportive campus environment measure, for example, but there's an interesting drop in the rating between first-year and upper-year co-op students as compared with first-year and upper-year regular students, a distinction that I think is an important one given the importance of work experience or co-op education here. Finally, despite differences between Canadian institutions and U.S. participants, NESE has a wonderful value for us, not entirely as a comparative tool, but something that allows us to compare ourselves with ourselves over time, to simply analyze where we're going on these different indicators, and in particular, how our efforts to intervene with new programs, new initiatives, some adjustments, whether that produces the kind of positive results that we should be striving for. We should be very encouraged in undertaking this exercise because we begin with a strong foundation. This is a proud place and has reason to be proud. And proud places, of course, are those that especially impose upon themselves that restless curiosity, that determination for a constructive self-renewal, very much part of the spirit of the University of Waterloo. In that light, just let me mention 3 or 4 indicators of that kind of constructive restlessness that is present in our very fabric. Our faculty members using e-portfolios to help students connect their learning experience in academic, workplace, and community learning contexts, especially important for us because our students are often spread in work experience. Our resident life staff working to enhance the living learning experience by integrating learning that happens in residence with learning that happens in the classroom. Bud and Lois with us today co-chaired that task force that presented not only a blueprint for on-campus living, but a matrix of the student experience and the kind of outcomes we should be expecting of our students. A recent study of cooperative education that seeks to better integrate workplace learning with campus learning, and if there's ever any defining feature of the University of Waterloo, it's work experience and how we bring that even more fully into our activities. TRACE, which holds department teaching days and regular workshops for faculty members who wish to explore the use of technology in the classroom. Teaching Excellence Academy for faculty, tentatively scheduled for April 06. I could go on, and all of these are initiatives to encourage, and many like them. There are enormous benefits to hearing about other university strategies to engage our students, and that's what our speaker will share today. It's very consistent with our own 6-decade report as we mark where it is we wish to go and what it is we want to do, that as we look at ourselves as an institution pursuing global excellence, we look beyond our borders. We earnestly think and search for the best experiences we can bring from elsewhere and adopt them to our own environment where they fit best, and take, as I say, a very strong institution even higher. As you know, I love the spirit of why not, and I love that lovely little aphorism from George Bernard Shaw that says, some people see things as they are and wonder why. We dream of things that ought to be and ask why not. It's a wonderful little couplet for a university because in the first proposition, it puts what we're always doing. We're wondering, we're asking why, we're exploring. And in the second part of the couplet it says, and from that comes some kind of purpose. And that purpose has a moral imperative to it. The purpose is to dream of where we ought to be. And I think that spirit of why not is what engages us in this exercise today. And I can't imagine a better person to help us with that exercise of why not. George Koo is Chancellor's Professor, as I mentioned, and Director of the Center for Postsecondary Research at Indiana University in Bloomington. He's a recipient of that university's prestigious Tracy Sonneborn Award for a distinguished career in teaching and research in 2001. He has written extensively about student engagement, assessment, institutional improvement, and university and college culture. And his most recent book is Student Success in College, Creating Conditions That Matter. George will deliver an address, and then Royden will take the stage, and I think George is prepared to respond to questions. Royden will then give the benediction, and I think Gail will give us the wrap-up. George, it's a delight to have you here with us. We welcome you to our university and to this podium.
Thank you very much. Waterloo. Thanks for the ice. I was not born with skates, as some of you noticed as I was traversing the campus today. It's great to be in Waterloo, my first visit. I've had a chance to visit some universities in Canada. I don't have your language down. I will say college on occasion. I'm apologizing in advance for a familiar term to me that works well in the States but doesn't work too well here. People think I don't know what I'm talking about. Your presence here, David, Gail, Faculty Senate, says a ton about what this institution is trying to do and why the topic we're talking about today is important. And I want to tell you that there aren't that many places, and I've been to more than a few in the last 25 years, that can bring this kind of synergy to a task, what I happen to think is a very, very important task. So I salute you and I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish here. I want to talk a bit about what makes for really good universities based on some work that we've done over the last 25, 30 years, in particular the last 4 or 5. And I know we come from kind of different segments, if I can say that, of university life. Some of you work with students primarily in the classroom, and some in labs, and some in studios, and some outside the class. And some of you work with them very, very closely in settings that we probably don't want to know too much about. Life outside the classroom can be particularly challenging and stressful, and sometimes we see students at their worst, and we see them at their best in those venues. And all of these things really matter, no matter what our background or socialization or point of view is. I think we're pretty much into this for the same thing, and that we do want them to leave this place with the richest, most powerful experience we can use our resources to muster. One of the things I want you to be thinking about today, and you know, by the way, I'm going to be talking a lot about research in the United States. And David's already kind of hinted at this. I mean, there's good news and bad news there. The good news is we've got a lot of it. The bad news is not all of it may translate as effectively as I'd like. And so you're going to have to help me here. You're going to have to do a lot of this translation yourself. Some of these things are going to fit perfectly. Some of them you're going to say, I'm not sure that works for us. But one of the that doesn't work for us kinds of questions you need to ask is, why doesn't it work? Does it not work because it ought not to work here? Or doesn't it fit because we just don't do things that way? And we could if we chose, but we choose not to. And does that really deliver the highest quality education for our students? So I think that's what kind of cross-national swiping can do for us. If you'll stand back and ask the question, why not? You may come up with some different answers. But one of the other things that I've caught wind of just in the last 14 hours is maybe a precipitous moment in time here where taking stock of what the University of Waterloo is supposed to do for students. Now, we have some kind of general kind of framework for that, but there seem to be some people asking questions, could we get more specificity? Can we ground this in empirical data? Will we know it when we see it? And if we know it, can we measure it? And can we figure out whether it's happening to a great enough extent across large numbers of students? So even if you find yourself daydreaming, which you probably no doubt will at some point during this, what is it we would like to be known for here? What is the nature of the distinctive imprint that Waterloo wishes to be known? And how would that be manifested in students' behavior in class, out of class, but most importantly, beyond their years with us? So I'm going to talk a bit about this notion of student engagement. I'm going to talk about a project that we've done. I'm going to talk about a lot of things, and I'm going to run out of time, and so people are going to have to be waving at me when I get close to the bewitching hour, and I'm apologizing in advance for that. I want to talk with you, though, first, a couple of quick vignettes, two very different institutions, both of which, though, are research universities. Some of you may be surprised by the first. The Texas El Paso is better known today for the movie Glory Days. Probably none of us have seen it yet, but we will. It's a movie about their national championship basketball team, 1963. Back in those days, the University of Texas at El Paso was a sleepy little college on the border that fashioned, actually it wasn't imagined, it fashioned itself as being Harvard on the border. It was trying to promote itself to affluent West Texans, all of whhom were white. And that's how the faculty thought about itself. And they persisted with this image through the early 1970s, faltering. They would start something, it wouldn't work. A woman by the name of Diana Natalicio went there as a trailing spouse. She was on a probationary appointment in communication studies, and one thing led to another. Pretty soon she was a tenure-track faculty person, and then she was a department chair, then she was the provost, and by the late 1980s, she became the president. But long before that, she recognized that El Paso and environs was changing dramatically in front of everyone's eyes. And to pretend they were Harvard on the border was pure folly. And she began to talk quietly, and then when she became president, she declared that the University of Texas at El Paso would be, and is, an Hispanic Majority institution, which drove the faculty crazy because they said, oh, wait a minute, we can't be known as that because we're not going to get grants. And she'd say, well, we don't have any now. But what will our colleagues think around the country, and so on and so forth. And so this was an uphill struggle, but to cut to the chase, she started knocking on doors in Washington, D.C. She took Hispanic serving created a huge advantage out of it. She began, I shouldn't say she, her faculty began to get funding from the National Science Foundation and other large federal, corporate, philanthropic sponsors. And now they are, I think, the leading producer of Hispanic degrees in engineering. They have one of 5 model minority and engineering programs at UTEP. Beyond that, they took what was a very effective learning community for Hispanic students because they knew they had tremendous obstacles to overcome in terms of their educational preparation, and they developed a model first-year learning community, which has now become the framework campus-wide at UTEP. Well, we'll talk more about learning communities later. So this is a place that chose to take control of its future with strong leadership, but mostly with faculty endorsement of what I'm going to come to call effective educational practice. Now, the University of Michigan is a very different kind of a story because they have been at the very top of the United States pecking order for public research universities for a long, long time, and with good reason. We won't need to go into that. But in the mid-1980s, when some foment was happening in the states around undergraduate education, the then provost there, who became later president, appointed a blue ribbon task force to look at the quality of undergraduate life. He had no other recourse but to bring in, this was a strategic move on his part, he brought in all the titled professors from the College of Arts, Literature, and Science and said, what should we do to improve the quality of undergraduate education? I'll fast forward. The University of Michigan has done 6 major studies of the quality of its undergraduate experience there between the late 1980s and 2001. Decided to sink $18 million. Now, Michigan, you could say that's a margin, it's a rounding error, maybe 18, but it's 18 million that could have gone to other initiatives. They opened up a kind of an internal RFP process, request for proposals, to everybody, students, staff, faculty. What ideas do you have? And we're particularly interested in collaborative work across faculty, staff, and students. Good ideas we may choose to fund if we can find ways of generating assessment data to demonstrate that how we're using the loot actually matters. Some of you from the residence life folks I know have visited Michigan because it's a hotbed of living learning communities. They've been around a long time, and they're stretching that influence around the campus. But my point here, and they created a set, for now, professors, a set of faculty, distinguished professors, who would commit themselves to undergraduate teaching. Finally, they committed the university to providing a small, i.e. 20 to 25 students, seminar for every first-year student. Their point was, we can't provide small seminars for every student, but we can sure guarantee that every student will get at least one. So the connections between students and faculty can start to happen in the first year. 2 very big universities, highly decentralized, ought to start sounding familiar, going about the task of enriching the vitality and quality of undergraduate education in very, very different ways. We know about these places because we had a chance to look at them up close and personal in this project we call DEEP. Why is it that they became so successful? What is it they do? I want to tell you more about that in a minute. We picked these places. There are more than 20 in the States, certainly, but we only had enough money to do 20. You know, $2 million only goes so far. And we picked them on two criteria. We just didn't pick them out of a hat. We didn't, simply go with reputation and ranking and so forth. In fact, if we did, UTEP would not have made it to the screen. These were places that had higher than predicted graduation rates. Graduation rates are a big deal in the States right now, and I gather they're becoming a bigger deal in Canada as an accountability point of emphasis. One measure, it's only one measure of student success. It doesn't tell us necessarily how much students have learned, but at least we can track it, and we can hold institutions to a degree accountable for it. So these were places where graduating more students than kind of social science regression models would suggest that they would. They weren't graduating everybody. Michigan does a great job. They're close to 85% or so, maybe 88. UTEP, on the other hand, is terrible. They only graduate 28% of their students after 6 years, but they're only predicted to graduate 21% because 60% English is a second language. Most are first-generation students. 10% cross the border from Waterloo, Mexico every day to go to school at UTEP. You're more likely to hear Spanish on the campus than English. So they're, on the margin, they're making a contribution. And they had higher than predicted, same kinds of modeling scores on the National Survey of Student Engagement. In other words, these were places that were doing something for two students that was adding an additional measure of value. And this notion of NESI and engagement, every generation comes up with its own language. This particular volume, the Ernie Pasquarella, Patrick Terenzini, some of you heard me mention this earlier this morning, this is a synthesis of all of the really good research on what matters to student learning and development during college. And one of the unequivocal conclusions they draw at the end of this volume, 640 pages, by the way, if you had two of these and you have rear-wheel drive, you're good to go to Toronto today in the weather, I think, because you get really good traction. Anyway, the extent to which we can get students involved in meaningful activities, academic in class, out of class, between students and faculty, this is the kind of stuff that matters to student engagement. And it's a simple set of algorithms here, really. And very important for us to acknowledge this because it does come out of the research. I'm not making this up. It really doesn't make much difference who students are, what kind of background they come from when they get to Waterloo. You've got a pretty good draw. You get pretty street smart, school bright, maze bright students. It's not so much who the students are when they arrive that matters to what they get out of this place. It's what they do while they're here. Right? So even the less well-prepared students can really make huge gains here if we get them involved in the right kinds of things. And we can do better on the right kinds of things. We know much more now about what more effective teaching and learning practices look like, how to design living and learning environments. So how we work with students and what we ask them, require them, cajole, whatever it is to do. And our argument here, which was the argument out of this project I'm about to talk with you more about, was there are some places that do this work better, and we think we can learn some things from them. We know what these things are. I'm not going to go through these. They're very familiar. We've already talked about student-faculty interaction. David has talked about that a bit. How we get students more actively involved in their own learning. And by the way, you don't look very good on this. That was the topic of the conversation for the morning work group. That could be a cultural thing. It's a fascinating problem. I'm going to come back to one or two of these examples a little bit later with you. We know, for example, that the most complicated kind of exchange up here happens to be time on task. Is a very, very complicated way of understanding that the more time students spend studying, the more they learn, you know. More time. Are you out there? Anybody out there still out there with me? In any event, we can go through these and we can speak volumes about each, and there are many, many more. So this is the basis of this little NESI survey and the reason we got involved in this work. There's a 2-year college version. Community colleges are very big in the States, and this project is big, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not going to go through this stuff and so on and so forth. This is what we ask. And I don't know if it's better than the essay question or not, but it is a very short survey. So we don't know everything there is to know, or we don't know everything that matters really to Waterloo and Waterloo students, but we have some pretty good ideas about how institutions perform on this. And we've boiled these down. David's given you a foreshadowing of this in his opening remarks. This is social science jargon. We've boiled this down into kind of 5 clusters of student behavior and institutional performance that we know matters to the desired outcomes. We know that if we can set the bar high, if we can increase expectations for student performance, if we can get them to write more with feedback, very important point, not just writing vast amounts, not just reading vast amounts, but actually then getting them to do things with it, more than memorization, but the application and synthesis. We know that if the right kinds of interactions occur between students and faculty, positive things are likely to happen. And it's not simply going and having a Coke or sitting at a bar and talking. It's the substantive exchanges. We can get after that over wine and cheese later, perhaps. Active and collaborative learning. Are they puzzling through problems in the company of peers, which mimics what they're going to be doing in real life? That's why your co-op programs are so powerful in many ways, even though you may not be capturing and squeezing as much out of that experience as we might. But taking responsibility, making class presentations, have a chance to test your ideas in the context of the class with peers. Is the place supportive? You know, student perceptions matter. They don't matter so much in terms of how much they learn. They simply matter whether they'll stick around, whether they will stay on task, whether they will take risks. So the extent to which we can create a welcoming, affirming environment. And of course, I don't know who these students are, but some of your students find this place more welcoming and affirming than others. And NESI can be a bit of a diagnostic in that regard. And the extent to which we can create enriching experiences. The co-op is a huge advantage for many of your students. So a study abroad for some, so could be doing research with a faculty member, and so on. In any event, so we have these. So let me ask you this question. Prompt feedback. Prompt feedback is considered, it was on that earlier slide, you know, as an effective educational practice. Now, we can quibble about what the word prompt means, and even perhaps what we mean by feedback. But what percent do you think of your first-year students at Waterloo say they never get it? Never. 4 classes, 5 classes. Hasn't happened. What do you think? What do you think?
I think 6%.
You think it's 6? And what faculty are you from?
From the faculty of environmental studies.
And it actually could be true for environmental studies. Yeah. It's not true for Waterloo, but it might be true for... Now what is disappointing about this is not just what it is in terms of its local context, but what it looks like relative to other universities. So here you have the G10, the contrast that we were talking about, David mentioned earlier, and then the DOC extensive universities are your counterpart places in the States, the Michigans and the UTEPs and my university and so on and so forth. And so I just, you know, on the high ends here, you don't look all that different from the G10 schools. So would this be then a cultural difference? And if it is, how would you explain it? Is there any explaining to do? Or is it that Canadian students somehow define prompt differently than students in the States? I don't know. And we certainly aren't going to run off and reinvest resources here for this purpose without knowing more about what's going on here. But this is one of the starker contrasts between Canadian universities, G10 schools anyway, and what's going on in the States. And I have to say that if we were to have seen these data, we don't have these data from 15 years ago, but I think in the States, I know in the States, we've made a tremendous effort. Well, the Michigan example. At least every student there in the first year has one of these small classes where it's, granted, easier to provide feedback. It's easier to assign writing assignments. Some of us over dinner last night were bemoaning the fact that you can run into a senior at Waterloo who's never written a paper. Isn't that what we said last night? I'm sure there are only 3 of those here. And you see a similar pattern with seniors. Well, I'm not here to try to sell NESI, but I am here to say that you have these data, and you're going to get another set of it. And I think there's great advantage to be had by digging into some of this, looking at it by faculty. Bob has already done that, and his colleagues have done this, and you see some differences, some provocative differences by faculty. Speaking of faculty, we have another survey I'm here to sell you. We actually have a faculty version of this, and I just want to play with your mind a little bit. As faculty type, those of us who work with students in the classroom, the mantra, the academic mantra, this does hold for Canadian and American faculty. We expect what? Students to spend how much time studying outside the classroom? How many hours for every class hour? 2 to 3. And we heard 4 this morning. Someone said 4. I don't think anyone said 5. We wouldn't believe you if you said 5. But it's not unusual for faculty members to say 2 to 3, which would mean that Waterloo students, on average, ought to be spending about 30 hours a week, the full-timer, right? Well, most faculty say students ought to be spending that much time, but even in their heart of hearts, when you ask them, they will agree. I usually often refer to this as higher education's dirty little secret in the States. Even though we say one thing, we really don't believe it is happening, and you wonder, who's in charge of the classroom? Who's setting the bar? What's being required of students? Now, here's another way of looking at this, back to the prompt feedback question. How many faculty do you think, what percent of faculty say they give prompt feedback? How many of you who are teaching, who have an opportunity to give feedback to students, either inside or outside, how many of you say, I do give prompt feedback to faculty? Well, some of you are afraid to raise your hand because almost all faculty say they give prompt feedback. Right? And it's not so bad. It could be worse. We get about 2/3 of the students who say it. Now, here's a great place for you to raise your hand and say, Professor Koo, with all due respect, this is a bunch of malarkey. Because faculty have one view of feedback and students have another view of feedback, and you're asking different kinds of questions. This is apples and oranges, and, when do we start with the wine? Well, we might have an apple and an orange on the table here. The question is, how do we turn it into a tangerine? Oh, I've never used that analogy, and I won't use it again because it doesn't quite fit. But my point here is, and this is a generation of students, of course, for whom feedback is the press of a button. I'm on my machine, and I know whether I got it right. I know whether I got what I wanted or not. And if I don't, I'll go on to the next thing. And so the expectations, their expectations for what goes on in your class and in your class and in your class need to be sharpened and set in a way that will serve our pedagogical purposes and the larger kind of outcomes we're after. To pretend and assume that we're on the same wavelength is way off. What we know from research on college student learning and effective teaching practices is that when faculty members organize classes in various ways and they prompt students and they remind students on a weekly or class basis about what we're trying to do here, what we're going to cover now, when we know we're going to get here. The same thing can be done with setting expectations for feedback at the beginning and reminders throughout. This is a generation of, let me go beyond that. What am I going to do there? The point I want to leave you with here at this moment in time is that when faculty members ask students to do certain things, whether it's coming to grips with diverse perspectives on what we are studying in this class, whether it's to write short or long papers, whether it's to try to apply what we're learning in this class to other classes or their lives outside the classroom, when assignments are created that way, when faculty themselves say they're creating those assignments, say they're requiring students to write more, students write more. They report applying what they're learning more frequently. It's almost, we don't see this in social science or human behavior, it's almost one-to-one. What you ask as a faculty person, students to do, and if you surround that with other effective educational practices, it does no good to ask students to write a lot if they don't get feedback on their writing. That could be exercises in mediocrity, and we don't need more of that. So in some instances, we may want to ask students to write less, but provide more feedback, if you follow what I'm saying here. Institutions that go after this stuff in an intentional way, and you've got a hotbed now sprouting up here of scholarship of teaching and learning and the other learning communities here. Let me get rid of that. This is just a lot of garbage. What I want to do is to tell you a little bit about these places that we had the privilege of learning more about. These 20, others now have labeled them high-performing. We wanted to call them simply pretty darn good universities. How did they get there? What did they do? What is it like? These are the 20. They're very different types of institutions. That was intentional on our part. These are not the best 20 schools in the United States on either graduation rates or student engagement, but they are a diverse set. They meet the test. Something's going on here that got students to be more engaged and kept them around, or some features helped them graduate on the 6-year basis. And you'll see some places that are more like you than others. We could learn, I think there's a fallacy here that we can't learn anything, for example, from Wofford College, which is a small liberal arts college. It's the smallest college in the United States to play Division I football, if that means anything to you. I asked Bernie Cunningham, the president there, why they play the University of Maryland at College Park every other year, and he said $750K. I just hope none of the boys come back broken. Anyway, is there anything to learn? Is there anything for Wofford to learn from a women's college? Oh, I think there is. But I'm going to focus most of my examples on places that are more like you for the face validity here, not take on your challenge. How we did this work is explained in the book. Everybody ought to have a couple of copies before they leave today. But it was a massive project. We talked with 2,700 people, many of them more than once. We had a large team of researchers, blah, blah, blah. Trust me on this, it's all written. But the point now is for you to be thinking about, I'm going to provide only a few examples as time permits, about what some of these places are doing to enhance academic challenge, to encourage student-faculty interaction, and so forth. And there are implications up and down the line, I think, for any institution, but since it's Waterloo, for Waterloo. And then hopefully you'll go away, but you won't go away mad. You'll go away, I hope, pondering and maybe a little consternated, the pearl coming out of the consternated oyster. And I hope there'll be some people then who'll wrestle you to the ground and trap you in small groups in days and months beyond this to see whether some of these ideas have their place at Waterloo. And I want you to hold yourselves to a little higher standard here. I don't want you to be, positively restless places even sometimes can say, well, we look a little better than we probably are. That was supposed to be a joke. Fine. All right, what about this? Can someone translate this for me? They got it right off at the University of Texas at El Paso, I'll tell you. There are a lot of ways to get to the top of this mountain, and so I'm not here to present you with a blueprint or just the kind of the one best way. It's got to be done the Waterloo way, although that can get you into trouble too, because the Waterloo way may be the problem in some instances. If we get time, we'll come back to this knotty little thing, nettlesome thing called campus culture. So there are a lot of different ways to get there, and the one thing that is impossible, I think, for me to overemphasize, though you'll probably disagree by the time we're done, is that if you can find some things that work, some configurations of first-year seminars or learning communities, safety nets, for example, I know the first-year engineering program, kind of built in these redundant safety nets. Why is it that some of these things aren't taking root elsewhere when you have evidence that they're working? In this book, and you've got a handout, I think, but maybe you don't, that summarizes these kind of 6 conditions that were more or less shared across these 20 very different places. And we could spend our next hour or two talking about each of these, and I'm not going to do it. I'm going to give you a few examples, but mostly I'm going to focus on more specific practices that are in play at these places. And it's no one of these is more important than the others, but they have to, like most other organizational theorists would say, kind of work together. I was taken, though, with your opening comments, David, about number 5. Our language is improvement-oriented ethos. And that's really not being completely satisfied. In fact, let me just give you a quick example. We went to one of these colleges. It was our second visit. We made 2 rounds of visits to each of these places. We wrote up a report. We got some feedback. So we weren't just blowing smoke. We thought we knew what we found, but we wanted to be sure that people would validate. We went to a place, sat down 9 o'clock in the morning with the provost. He had read the report, and we're ready to take notes. We wanted to get, change the factual, correct the factual errors, find out what we missed, who we ought to talk with next, what were the big holes. And he said, this is a fine report. We really appreciate your coming here and doing this. Now, What can we do better? What can we do better? I mean, that's not a terribly powerful statement taken out of context, but it represents the difference between pretty good and getting really good. Somebody's always asking, and we have dozens of stories like that. Well, living mission, lived educational philosophy. I didn't think I had these slides in here, actually. I thought I was going somewhere else with these. But in any event, here's George Mason. A young place like yourself. They're actually younger than you are. They were founded in the mid-1960s. And when they started, they said to themselves, look, we're not going to stop experimenting. And this is how they recruit faculty members. We want to be in the right place at the right time, and what the right time is going to change for us. We're going to be here, however. These are places that have figured out not only who they are, but that these values become almost palpable. And you can predict how a decision will be made. You can't always predict the outcome, but you'll know who will be involved, and you'll know who will come together. The University of Kansas is a research university, and like so many, including my own, found itself warped, out of whack in terms of its reward system and what faculty members were doing and what was valued in terms of teaching and research. And their language, in retrospect, is a sea change in terms of giving more emphasis to the quality of the undergraduate experience, particularly in the instruction. One of the things that they've done at KU, is how they refer to themselves, is in order to guarantee smaller enrollment classes throughout the 4 years of study, they've created some huge, mega-sized classes. They built facilities that would hold 800 and 1,000. I mean, it's very counterintuitive. But they did it because of enrollment pressures and not getting funding from the state to increase numbers of faculty. And so now they've done things, but these are not large lecture rooms. They're outfitted, they're techno-rich. Cameras will zoom in on someone sleeping. Who's sleeping out there? Camera would zoom in on you, and someone, and you don't fall asleep in that class anymore. And you go to that class because there'll probably be a pop quiz. So the institutions that have 50 and 60% average enrollments in lectures, we're just asking for it because there's nothing going on there that requires you to be there. But if you're giving a pop quiz, or you've broken that large lecture into some small working groups, that one of the days we were there's a class of 850. They were in the room for 10 minutes, and boom, they burst out the doors because they were given an assignment that had to take them outside into the campus to compute wattage in various areas of the campus. And they were back in that room 15 minutes before the class ended, debriefing with the TAs, very tiered instructional. I mean, it's an example, It may not work at lots of institutions, but it's working at KU. These are places where it really is mostly about what is happening. We called it an unshakable focus on. We were trying to come up with something that would be memorable. Unshakable focus on student learning. The cool passion for taking students where they are when they start and moving them along to a point where they are very different. We overuse the word transformation, But if we were trying to describe what these institutions wanted to do, it would be to transform the students that showed up. And so we found the phrase cool passion to be a much better description here, contrasted with kind of a hot passion. We think of passion, we think of something that might burn out, but these were places where the flame, of teaching and learning continued to burn, bent toward engaging pedagogies. These are places where at a lot of schools, the concepts of active and collaborative learning, they're there, but they're on the margins. At these places, they have now infiltrated and they've become front and center. Not every faculty member uses them. I don't mean to say that. But they're no longer viewed as experimental, although a lot of experimenting goes on. You want students to learn how to write? Then you require them to write. Is this labor intensive? Yes, it is. Does it mean we aren't going to do some other things if we want to choose to go this route? It certainly does. And then there are edifices set up around the campus to make this work. I've already mentioned El Paso. One of the things I didn't mention about El Paso is because of the cultural dynamics working there, and to get more Hispanics to take advantage of university study, they had to move a lot of what they were doing into the community so that people there who had no experience with post-secondary education would have a sense. So they teach a lot of classes in the community, not simply because it's kind of an extension operation. They simply said it was a mandate that they had in order to encourage more Hispanics. And there are certain things with certain kinds of students that business as usual doesn't work. So if you want cross-cultural experiences, having students go off for a year abroad is great, but a lot of students today have financial limitations, or they have family limitations, and so creating shorter, intensive opportunities for students to do that. No matter if you were on the mountaintop at Swanee, 10,000 acres, the domain they call it, or at Alverno in Milwaukee, or Cal State, which is a former military base, no matter where you were, I don't know, I haven't had a chance to really meet and know Waterloo students, but one of the fascinating things is every place we went, students would say kind of the same thing. Boy, is this a neat place for a college. I can't imagine there can't be any better place, right? How does a university create that kind of affective tie with students? And it's not all about football. Some of these places don't play football or that. It's not all about that kind of out-of-class stuff. It's intentionally tying the institution. You have an advantage with co-op and so forth and so on. Place conscious, taking good care. But Cal State wove it tightly into the academic program. They believe so strongly in terms of their mission that connecting to the environment was so important that they require 2 service learning classes. These are courses, these are academic experiences across disciplines that take students into the community, to do work, and it's tied back. You've got a few things going on here, I understand, in service learning. It's a very powerful part of the Cal State Monterey Bay, and I have to say, the research on service learning is very, very powerful. You can't see a study that doesn't show students gaining more, investing more, not just in that course, but in other courses. Cal State Monterey Bay, by the way, also, to socialize new faculty, takes them out in buses. A lot of these faculty will come from New York City or Fairfield, wherever, and when they get to Monterey Bay and when they drive around and see where students are coming from, the neighborhoods in which they live, it's a very different sense of who these students are that I'll be working with. I'm sure you do a lot of this. Mason, for example, has got the advantage of Washington, D.C., huge, all sorts of things going on, and very, very intentional ways of tying it to the campus. More environment stuff. Let's just blah, 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 and press on. And, of course, all right, digital environments, Anyway, there's more to be said about each of these, and I want to be mindful of time and give us time to talk. One of the most interesting findings for me out of this project was the ability of these places to tell students very directly, consistently, repeatedly, what they needed to do to survive and thrive here. I don't mean just standing up at orientation, giving a lecture, and telling people to go off and read this. I mean built into courses, designed in, required things that had to be done. Sometimes the student culture carried this. It starts with what we say to them before they arrive, certainly. So you have Miami University, which is not, there's a lot of things that are similar to Miami, just in terms of student draw. They're a little smaller than you are, 15, 16,000. But they have, like a lot of places, you too, front-loaded a lot of the resources, but they've tied intentionally what goes on outside the classroom. For example, the staff who live with students in residence halls, they are the student's first-year advisor. So they see students 24/7. You don't have to go way out of your way to get academic counseling and advice. It's a model that works for them. It may not work for you. And there are a lot of other things that they have done. Here's KU. Can you imagine getting, maybe you do this, I don't know, but they get more than 3,000 new first-year students in the football stadium. And they learn the goofy things like the rock chalk chant and what a Jayhawk is. And it's corny. If you're out of it, it's corny. But, boy, the Jayhawk is such a powerful symbol in the state of Kansas. And they finish this off with a crescendo. They ask the legacies to stand. And so they're upper-class students in there, and one by one they say, and pretty soon almost everybody is standing in there. Not that everybody went to the KU, but it's a very, very powerful. So there's a sense of connecting the emotion to, and figuring out who these people are and tying the way we deliver instruction. And then it's time. The reward system has to work. And these are places that, an early warning system at these places is not only the registrar sending a note to a faculty member in week 9 out of a 15-week period saying the student is in trouble academically. That's way too late. Students can't salvage an academic term by that point. So things are happening very, very early. Lots of Kansas has decided at many institutions in my country, the graduation, now we count 6-year graduation rates. You're probably doing something similar here. Kansas has made a concerted effort to get students through in 4. Some of this is class scheduling, but a lot of it is letting students know how they need to do it and having advisors hold students accountable. Faculty members now routinely, not all certainly, I don't mean to say that, but faculty members will, in a class, announce the kinds of things that students ought to be reminding students. It takes about 25 seconds to do it, but the messages can be much more powerful coming sometimes from faculty. Michigan has more student support services. It's counterintuitive. They get such bright students, such highly motivated students, but they have more student support services than any other university I've ever seen. They're not necessarily out in front of the public, but people find students who need them. This happens to be Paso, which has been promoted primarily for minority students. And these, as I mentioned, these places are positively restless. Someone's asking the question. I've already given you that example. This is not about, I should say, questioning who we are and fundamentally why we're here. We've pretty much settled that, though on occasion, you'll get a Wheaton College which goes from single sex to co-ed, and you'll get some other sea change shifts like you might get at the University of Kansas. So there's a general acceptance of who we are. It's whether we can do things better here. And this notion of shared responsibility. This is about all of us tending to the commons. There's lots of talk about collaboration. You're doing it here. You're in the throne of talking about bringing the out-of-class experience closer to the academic experience and vice versa. But these are places that have figured out kind of how to do it and where learning takes place and where support comes from. Some of these places like KU, they've built it in. By faculty senate charter, 20% of all the committees have students on them. and including most search and screen, not the personnel committees. You know where we're going with some of the confidential stuff. But not only are students on these committees, but the president or the chair of the committee is always a faculty member, including the community assembly. President of that group is always a faculty member, and the vice president is always a student. And it is a hoot, they say, when the faculty member's gone, on a professional trip or something like that. Students end up running meetings there. Well, you have to be there to... let me just press on. I want to finish here in about 5 or 10 minutes, so we do have some time to talk. These data that you're getting from NESE and from other sources, they're really... It's not about the numbers per se. It's about what the numbers represent in terms of the concepts that they theoretically hold true or important to us. And so, one of the things I hope you'll be thinking about in terms of Waterloo, some of these ideas and others that we've talked about this morning in a smaller group and that you might read about, what should we be trying to do here? How clear is the path to student success at Waterloo? It may be clear in engineering because, it's a cohort, it's a smaller group, and they do things together, and they learn from one another, and that's good news and bad news sometimes because they can become isolated and insulated. What do people need to know to survive here? Now, we can say we do that during orientation, and we do a little bit of it. Are we socializing students early enough to the things that we want them to value, and how do we know? Are there things that work really well here in some units, but no other units do things like that? Why? If we find something that works, can't we not adapt it or mimic it or find some counterpart so that more students get touched, whether it's a first-year seminar or a learning community experience? If you find something that works, this may not be the Waterloo way, certainly not the Indiana way, Indiana University way, but why can't we require something akin to it if it's educationally sound? Who's going to take the lead on this set of initiatives at Waterloo. By the way, you can ignore all this stuff. These are first-order considerations. I'm just laying them out because I'm on a plane tomorrow, and you'll have to worry about what happens next. But if everybody is responsible for it, you know, I'm talking now out of both sides of my mouth. You know, this is kind of Janusian thinking and talking. On the one hand, everybody has to take responsibility for this. On the other hand, if we let everybody take responsibility for it, it may not get done because someone else is in charge of making sure it gets done. Well, there are some things that can be, you know, some kind of best practices in this kind of work. So someone has to take the responsibility. And then how do we squeeze the synergy out of this in a way that's consistent with our values and our culture? What else is going on? You know, almost all campuses have a set of diversity initiatives, right? Someone is working with this group and someone's working with that group. But we don't think about how we might tie that to the scholarship of teaching and learning, which is yet another group on this campus. And then there's an assessment group. You know, we have an assessment committee. And they're supposed to be collecting data on the impact of various initiatives. And we don't bring them into the conversation with the folks who are doing diversity work or the living learning community. Now, not everybody can be talking with everybody else at the same time, but somebody ought to be mapping what is going on and drawing, you know, instead of dotted lines, maybe darkened in lines. There are a lot of things going on almost every campus, but they tend to operate in isolation. Sometimes that's following the cultural mores of how the university itself works. Ultimately, we get down to dollars and cents. This little book by Michael Lewis, some of you may be familiar with it. The Oakland A's, the professional baseball team in the States, for many years had the lowest or second lowest payroll in Major League Baseball. And they were always getting to the playoffs. So they were finding talent where no one else could find it, and they were paying less than market prices for it because they began to explode the myths about what makes for a good professional baseball player. The old story about sending the experienced scout out, and they would, that guy's about, 6'2", and he looks like he can throw well. I bet he runs fast. Oh, he hits a home run. That's the kind of... Well, Billy Bean out there and others, he's now that approach using data to determine how professional baseball teams actually win games. And it's not the home runs, it's the on-base percentage that turns out to be very, very important. Now most Major League Baseball teams have MBA wizards trained at Harvard and Stanford in their front offices crunching numbers. Well, if you were to crunch some numbers about throughput, who starts here? What do they look like? At what point do they leave university? In what areas? Would you discover some things that you don't presently know about the student experience here? Maybe you've already done this. It's not just about the number. So you've got to move from the number then to the environment. So, who's doing the right things? Can we find more of them to work here? What programs? The hardest thing, and none of these schools do it well. Haven't been to one yet that does it well, so maybe nobody can. What isn't working? And this is really hard because we're somebody's invested in that, psychically and financially. But there are things that probably aren't working very well at Waterloo. And to say to get rid of them doesn't sound very polite, but how do we sunset them so that we can move resources to things that really would make a difference? And it's always about people, and most of these places spend a lot of time finding the right people. Finding the right people. Jim Collins wrote this little book called Good to Great, and one of his primary theses is, you want to get the right people on the bus. Meaning, what is the Waterloo way? What do we want Waterloo to be like? What does it mean in terms of the faculty and staff resources? It's better to recruit the right people on the front end and then make sure we socialize them the right way. There's much more to be said about all of that. I've mentioned very quickly collaboration, and we can't do this work. We simply can't do it in the silos that probably made universities like Waterloo great. Today, the world is much more interconnected in so many different ways, and for us to get the work done, we're going to have to find. So there are a variety of really powerful initiatives like learning communities where students take the same 2 or 3 classes together. This work cannot be done by individual units. You need people in residence life. if there's a residential component to it, you need advisors. Some of the most powerful programs we've seen have got kind of tag team, where a librarian, are there any librarians in the room? Yeah, yes, you're not raising your hand, but what an underused resource. I don't mean in terms of knowing where books are and where information is, but librarians see students doing things, involved in activities that most of us who teach in the classroom and even work with students in residence or in student activities don't see them. So ask for a raise. But there are a lot of ways that we can get more people involved in some of this work, and ultimately it's really about the entire campus. I got to tell you this story about it's about difference makers. Now I'm running out of time. Catch me over wine and cheese. Sooner or later, it's about campus culture, and I don't know enough about this place to know I don't know enough about this place to know what we can't talk about. So I've probably already said some things I shouldn't have said. But, you know, there are things we can't do. No one ever tells you can't do them. You just figure this out on your own, right? And so maybe it's time to have a look, particularly for the disengaged, underengaged, the students who just can't find their way here. What is it about this place that may be turning them off, alienating them, in fact? It sounds to me like this notion of positive restlessness, it's certainly something that the president wants, and there may be enough evidence to suggest that you have it. Now, the next question is, how broad is it? Has it seeped into all the corners of the place where we need to have this willingness to question whether we're doing things as well as we can? You've seen that before. One way to find out a lot is actually to ask students. Some of the institutions have done very interesting work with, for example, NESI data. Handing the NESI data over to student government. I was at San Diego State a few months back, and the faculty have been talking about general education, revising the gen ed. I don't know if you use gen ed, general education as a... Don't use it? Yeah, this would be sets of skills and competencies that students ought to have, and then the delivery mechanism for it, courses that would give students. It's kind of like deciding who you want the Waterloo student to be. They would take certain. In any event, general education is a big deal in the States, and we never do anything about it, most of us. And so the faculty at San Diego State were talking about it for years, and the student government decided to do a survey on what students thought about the general education program. And so now their faculty senate there is now involved in looking at gen ed and taking it up as a cause. So you can learn a lot of things from students about, if you ask students what Waterloo might do to, for example, encourage more active and collaborative learning. That's mostly a faculty decision here, I realize, or to create a more supportive campus environment. You will hear some things that we might never think about. Now this is Jim Collins again. I'll just end with this notion of how you actually move from really, really good to great. I mean, maybe you are great. The NESI data would suggest, as it does for most institutions, there are places where improvement can be made. But none of this work certainly doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen without leaning and focusing on some very specific things. I've already mentioned the kinds of things. If you find things that are working, maybe you ought to be investing more resources in those kinds of things. Not everybody doing the same thing, but none of this takes place. This could be tonight in Waterloo. None of this takes place without making mistakes and without slipping and sliding and some backward movement. But it's too important. For what shall we be known? It's a really bedeviling question because it's so hard to answer, because it requires so many people to come to one mind on matters, at least at a level of generality that isn't so general that it means nothing. And it's worth, seems to me, it's worth pondering at this point in time. You know, who we get here, we can't do much about the nature of the students who arrive. But we can do something about what they think will happen to them. and what actually happens to them. And so when the final analysis is not so much about money. Oh, yeah, there'll be, redirected resources, and it'll be good to have more, always. More. That's what deans and department chairs are for, more. more. But ultimately, it's about the will. It's about taking what we know that works and making sure more of it happens more of the time.